Good evening, everyone, and I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledging elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people and all Indigenous people present here tonight. I would also like to recognize that we are on unceded land and that Indigenous people have been custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia for more than 65,000 years, and they were our first teachers and educators. Tonight, we acknowledge our Wurundjeri people's long-standing relationship with and caring of the lands and waterways the Kulin Nation lived and continues to live according to their own markings of the changing seasons. August is the orchid season and is marked by flowering orchids and silver wattle, which are actually yellow flowers, bursting into color. Wurundjeri people sees this as an indicator of the health of the people, animals, and the land. It is most appropriate tonight to recognize the place of Indigenous ethnologists in the academy as we prepare to listen to our guest speaker's presentation on cultivating leadership through Indigenous land relations. So welcome to the 2025 Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellowship Lecture. My name is Professor Marek Tesar, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Melbourne. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, I would like to acknowledge and thank Russell and Mab Grimwade Miegunyah Fund. Their support has made it possible for tonight's distinguished guest presenter, Professor Jen Hare, to be here in Melbourne as a visiting fellow. The Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellowship Program was established in 1993 by the University Council, and it was based on a recommendation from the Russell and Mab Grimwade Miegunyah Fund Committee, the body responsible for the management of the Russell Grimwade bequest. Sir Russell Grimwade was an industrial chemist by training and a man of wide-ranging interests, and was the author of 2 books. He was a member of the University Council for almost 20 years, from 1935, including a period as a Deputy Chancellor. Miegunyah is a loan word comprising of the Dura word Ganya, meaning house or dwelling, and the English possessive my, coming to mean my home, which was the Grimwade's home from 1911 to 1955. Awarded annually, these fellowships enable our distinguished overseas scholars of international distinction to come here and to make an extended visit to our university and contribute to the university's academic, intellectual, and cultural life. So I offer a very warm welcome to all of our guests tonight. In particular, I would like to recognize our distinguished guest, the patron head of the Russell and Mab Grimwade Miegunyah Fund, Angus Grimwade, who is here in the audience with us this evening. Furthermore, I would like to thank Professor of Indigenous Education, Elizabeth McKinley, recently appointed as Associate Indigenous at the Faculty of Education, for nominating our Miegunyah Visiting Fellow and for her work to prepare a program for Professor Jen Hare, including this public lecture. May I also take this opportunity to thank Liz in advance for delivering tonight's vote of thanks. Following Jen's presentation, there may be a time for audience participation, so I really encourage you to consider questions for Jen later on during discussion time. So before we hear about our guest presenter, I would like to tell you about Jen's career so far. Professor Jen Hare is an internationally recognized expert on Indigenous education and teacher education, holds a very prestigious Canada Research Chair Tier 1 for her pioneering work on Indigenous pedagogy. She is currently Dean of Education at the University of British Columbia and a Professor of Language and Literacy. Professor Hare is an Anishinaabe scholar and an educator from Mking First Nation, I apologize for my pronunciation, located in Northern Ontario, Great Lakes region. As an Indigenous scholar and educator, she has sought to transform education in ways that are more inclusive of Indigenous knowledges, cultures, histories, and languages, and improve educational outcomes for Aboriginal and Indigenous learners by centering Indigenous knowledge systems within educational reforms from early childhood to post-secondary education. Through an integrated approach to teaching and research, Professor Hare has worked to enrich teacher education with Indigenous perspectives, histories, and pedagogies. This has led to advancing innovations in the professional development of practicing and in-service teachers, so they are better informed of the place of Indigenous peoples, histories, perspectives, and pedagogies in their current teaching. Distinctive dimension of Jan's research is a community engagement approach that strives to ensure that teachers and schools become places of transformative learning, a focus that is vital to the success of Aboriginal learners. Her outstanding leadership and contributions to the field are reflected in her many invitations to be a visiting scholar at both national and international universities. She has been awarded more than 4 million in research funds and invited to provide over 60 keynote presentations. Jen has led a national Indigenous teacher education program at the University of British Columbia that has the purpose of increasing the number of Indigenous educators provincially and nationally. Professor Hare is also author of the groundbreaking MOOC course, Reconciliation Through Indigenous Education, to enhance understanding and knowledge of practices to advance reconciliation in the places where you live, you learn, and you work. So it gives my great pleasure now to welcome Professor Jen Hare to the stage for a 2025 Miegunyah Distinguished Visiting Fellowship to deliver the lecture, Cultivating Leadership Through Indigenous Land Relations. Please welcome.
Well, testing. Is it? Oh, thank you very much for that warm welcome to everybody. I always say, don't clap, just cite me. Okay, all kidding aside. So Bojo ani Janus Herdishnika, Zanishnabekwe, Chiging Indojaba, Musquim Akininda, Minawa Rirundri Aki. So Miigwech. So just a small greeting to you in my Anishinaabewin language. Thank you very much. I just want to thank Dean Tesar for such a, wow, I'm going to say just a generous introduction. My parents would be really, really proud. So thank you for that. I also want to say Chi-miigwech, which is big thank you. Chi means big, and so miigwech is thank you. So Chi-miigwech to the Russell and Nab Grimwade family for the legacy of the Miegunyah Distinguished Fellow Program, and to the committee. I think it's so wonderful to be able to bring international voices here to the University of Melbourne and here to the Faculty of Education. And I think in a world that is just increasingly characterized by conflict and complexities, a forum such as this is significant. And so I'm really pleased to be able to share perspectives and practices of Indigenous leadership that draw from my own experiences, as well as Indigenous knowledge teachings that I have received along the way, as well as scholarship that is largely centered from or comes from North America. I also want to extend my gratitude to Dr. Liz McKinley for putting forward my nomination to the committee, and also for her ongoing leadership in Indigenous education, both here at Melbourne and certainly internationally, as the Dean has pointed out. And it's just been wonderful to be hosted by the Faculty of Education. I had a wonderful afternoon spent with the Nanga project led by Dr. Melita Horgath, and it was just so incredible and so impressive to see a project focusing on national curriculum reform and to see a project of that scale and that impact. So really excited to see and learn about the work. So thank you very much for making that part of my visit here. In my greeting to you in my Anishinaabewin language, I did acknowledge the traditional owners here, and I got it. I was able to pronounce it correctly. Lots of practice in front of the mirror, even. So, but I live. Oh, here we go. Thank you. You just slid that in there with didn't even see you. Okay. So I live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And on this slide is a sign. This is a sign here from an exhibition that we have about 13 of these around campus. And it's an exhibition by Indigenous artist Edward Heapabirds. And it's really intended to disrupt our understanding of land and what it means to be on Indigenous lands. And so if you look, it's positioning settler lands, British Columbia, backwards to really disrupt our understandings of history of this place and who is host and who is guest. So I thought it would be a good start to set for this talk, our conversation together. So as we look to the land for inspiration, generative thinking, and even alternative theories to guide leadership practices within institutions where we live, learn, and work, I want to begin our conversation together this evening by first contemplating my own leadership journey. It is a journey that is continually being shaped by landscapes. In efforts to remain connected with his daughter, who was increasingly distanced by a move from central Canada to the West Coast for a career in academia, my father would take me for drives when I came to visit along the dirt, gravel, and paved roads of Manitoulin Island, Mindu-Minissing, where our First Nation community, Chiging, is located in Northern Ontario, Canada. And so here in the map, you can see BC, the coast, where I'm currently located, and the other red dot represents where Manitoulin Island. And Mindu refers to a spirit, the spirit that lives on the island, hence Manitoulin Island. Mindu-Minissing is the world's largest freshwater island located in Lake Huron. In these moments together, I could see my father carefully surveying these lands, as if moving about them in his thoughts. He talked about these lands as vastly different from his days as a young Anishinaabe man growing up there, recalling the colonial influences of encroaching development on the surrounding First Nations communities on the island and their resources, regulations on hunting and fishing that change our seasonal living and economies, or the government mismanagement of First Nations land sales around the island. I was especially attentive when he would pull over by a lake, forested area, or a small rocky roadside range, and we would just sit together in silence in his truck, where he may have just been hoping to see glimpses of places that have eluded settler colonial influences. Other times, he would narrate for me accounts of Indigenous resistance and resurgence, stopping the truck at places to explain Anishinaabe response and opportunities presented to the community that were changing the land, such as the Mother Earth Renewable Energy Project that has brought 2 large wind turbines to the community. He was concerned about the rising, this just makes me laugh. He was concerned about the rising population of wild turkeys near the community, given that they were sick with potential disease. And he was very upset about this, lamenting that inspectors only took notice of their numbers and less to the negative impacts on our local ecosystems. And on one visit, there were the remains of an Indigenous family, a First Nations family, nearly 300 years old, that were discovered nearby, requiring us to prepare them for a ceremonial return to the community. There were other moments where he would share how the Anishinaabe language reverberated across the land, always stopping at the sign entering the community that depicted 2 big bluffs with the name of the community written across. Chiging means by the bluffs, or a view from the bluffs, signaling that names of our Indigenous communities are based on how we perceive place in its features, locations, and even our movements on the land. Now, a good part of my leadership journey can be traced to the paths we traveled on those car rides. My father was a conduit to the landscape of leadership for me. I came to understand that our Indigenous world was not endlessly consumed by or always accommodating to the colonial world, demonstrated through his knowledge of this place. Our mapping exercise together was more concerned with developing my responsibilities to the Indigenous community than it was to locating geography around us. While there was immense comfort being held in these broader sets of relationships to each other, to the other than humans, the ancestors and the land, our time together was intended to establish my accountability to these relationships. It was not simply enough for me to value these relationships, but to uphold them through reciprocity and responsibility to our larger community. On reflection, I can appreciate his pedagogy, Indigenous pedagogy, his intentional constant return to these places together ensured for him I would take away important teachings of the land that I would then enact in my own life dedicated to Indigenous futures. Knowledge of the land as a physical, social, and spiritual being that guides Anishinaabe life is deeply transformative for me as I reflect on my own leadership development. For Indigenous people, the land has always communicated leadership, even in our earliest stories. For instance, I'm reminded of our Anishinaabe relatives' creation story. Now, I know that there are creation stories the world over that reflect the unique worldviews, values, and beliefs of people in the places they inhabit. And certainly, there are lessons for leadership that could be examined from multiple viewpoints within those stories. But for a moment, I want you to imagine a leadership that emulates from a relationship with the land. And I recognize for all of you here that your leadership takes different forms: community, classrooms, organizations, institutions, and even the dean. While there are variations of this story in our Anishinaabe tradition, I share the story as a means to consider land-based practices that emerge from Indigenous knowledges as a more holistic and multidimensional view towards leadership. And this is a painting by Norval Morrisseau, who's an Anishinaabe artist, very well-known Anishinaabe artist. And this is his version of our creation story. And I begin. When the original peoples strayed from their peaceful ways, it is told that the earth was flooded so that it might be purified. It was Nana Bojo, a shapeshifter who figures prominently in our teaching stories, and other animals that were able to survive the flood by floating on a log along with birds managing to fly above. They all looked out among the water in search of land, but it had been covered by this grand flood. It was Nana Bojo who encouraged the animals to begin a search below the waters for any sign of dirt or sand. As the animals took turns deep diving for any sign of earth they could grab below, they returned to the surface unsuccessful, grasping tirelessly for air from being beneath the water for such long periods of time. Beaver, loon, turtle, all iconic Canadian water animals, and even Nana Bojo tried, but all failed in their courageous efforts. It was Muskrat who stepped forward to also give it a try. He was gone for so long that Nana Bojo and all the other animals were certain that Muskrat had given his life trying to reach the bottom. But it was Muskrat who was successful in all the animals' attempts to bring up dirt from the depths below. Nana Bojo took the piece of earth from Muskrat's small paw and he placed it on the back of a turtle to create new lands. The wind blew from each of the 4 directions, expanding the earth on the turtle shell to form what is known today as Turtle Island, or perhaps more familiar to non-Indigenous people, North America. Our Anishinaabe creation story of the land is a teaching about mutual sustenance, where the land serves the animals and the human descendants that follow. From the Anishinaabe viewpoint, we see leadership as organized outside the human experience to include our inherent and ancestral connections to the land. The situation of the landless animals is resolved through cooperation and concern for the collective good, not for personal gain for Nana Bojo or any other single animal. Power and influence did not belong to any one being. Rather, leadership was leveraged through the strength and ingenuity of each animal in their relationship to navigating the water in its depth, its flow, its temperature, its turbidity. Much was expected of each of them to navigate the water world, the sky world, and the land world. However, their shared responsibility is towards ensuring a world for future generations of human descendants. Humanity is set only because of the interdependence on the other than humans in this creation story. We see leadership as diffused, shared, and emerging out of a particular need, offering an Indigenous decolonial view of leadership. Now, to give a fuller picture of how my leadership has been shaped, I also need to trace out another leadership landscape in which I am entangled. As an Indigenous woman, I work in the settler colonial context of the university, having held several leadership roles within a very large public institution. First, as director of the Indigenous Teacher Education Program, NITEP, celebrating 50 years, yes. Also Associate Dean for Indigenous Education, and now Dean of the second largest faculty of education in Canada. This part of my leadership journey can be easily characterized by what Australian scholar Tanya Fitzgerald describes as a triple bind. That is an Indigenous woman working in a predominantly white world within systems that value patriarchal leadership and subject to the myriad of judgments by others in the institution. My decision to take on the role of dean was a result of how I experienced the way senior Indigenous leadership roles were positioned in the university. Within the Indigenous leadership roles I held, I experienced the expectations to enact Indigenous plans, policies, and relations without sufficient decision-making capacity, and I would also say without sufficient resources. I wanted to step outside of Indigenous leadership roles and bring other ways of knowing to the mission of the university. Yet, as the university's first and only Indigenous dean, I often face the impossible dilemma of being perceived as only capable of doing Indigenous stuff rather than, and I quote here Candace Burnett-Dubosky's work, rather than being capable of engaging in various spaces and through various methods of leadership while continuing to be uniquely and authentically Indigenous. This leadership landscape I now find myself in is reflected in the metaphors by several scholars speaking to Indigenous leadership in universities. These metaphors speak to the precarity of practicing Indigenous leadership approaches in colonial spaces. Indigenous scholar, Waka Waka woman Tracy Bunda, and settler colleagues Lou Zippin and Marie Brennan point to the shaky bridge Indigenous people must cross when universities assume Indigenous people's priorities are the same as other people's within the institution. The danger of this pathway, they caution, is the disappearance of indigeneity as, and I'm going to quote their work here, merely another marker of diversity in an engulfing institution that does not care to recognize the distinctive sovereignty of Indigenous First Peoples, or how Indigenous viewpoints on the institution distinctively challenge normative white stream operations. Canadian Cree scholar Candace Burnett-Dubosky draws on cliff metaphors to describe Indigenous women's experiences of leadership in the university in her award-winning book, Tricky Grounds: Indigenous Women's Experiences in Canadian University Administration. She first discusses a familiar glass cliff phenomenon where women leaders are often made vulnerable through deliberate positioning in an organization experiencing conditions of uncertainty and stress. And she draws on scholars Ryan and Haslam's work on this glass cliff. She then articulates an Indigenous version, which she refers to as the Buffalo Jump Cliff. And this is what this picture then depicts. Buffalo, once an abundant source of food, or once an abundant food and resource, were herded off cliff formations to their deaths as a hunting technique by the Indigenous peoples of central Canada. She suggests that this historical practice of the Buffalo Jump Cliff to convey the treacherous terrain of the academic institution for Indigenous women being misled by the trickiness of settler colonialism in universities. Brunette Dubosky describes the landscape of leadership for Indigenous women as tricky ground seen in, and I'll quote her here, seen in the divide between rhetoric and experience, in the contradictions according to which Indigenous leaders are seen simultaneously as a symbol of the solution and the problem, in the tensions between the liberal academies' favoring of individualism and Indigenous communities' embrace of collectivism, and in the disjuncture stemming from being the subject of public celebration and being overly scrutinized by colonial surveillance. Now, to soothe myself when facing the terrains of bridges, cliffs, or tricky ground that forms the contours and markers of the post-secondary institution, I return to the time spent with my father moving about the island and to the Anishinaabe creation story so that we might consider together generative and, I would say, generous ways of shifting conceptions of leadership in colonial institutional landscapes. If mainstream institutions, such as higher education, are largely characterized by their cultures of heteronormativity, whiteness, heterosexism, hierarchy, and class privilege, as the scholarly writing describes, I would like us to consider ways of knowing and being that come from Indigenous peoples' relationship with the land, that come from on country, as likely a more familiar understanding here in Australia. To envision practices for leadership formed through relationality and reciprocity, so as to inspire different theories and practices for leadership. We need alternate visions of leadership in our institutions, rooted in healthy, respectful, and sustainable connections with each other, but also to the land. And this will come from other ways of knowing and being in the world. Indigenous ways of knowing and being are fundamentally tied to the lands, the skies, the water, tied to country. Indigenous land relations is an approach to living and learning that recognizes knowledge, history, story, and memory are embedded within landscapes, even within urban settings. Geographies are not only physical, but spiritual, linking us to our past, present, and future generations within an Indigenous land relations viewpoint. Forming an intimate connection with the land, our language expresses complex knowledge about the land, and how we live together with her. Cultural practices on the land through ceremony, story, and stewardship serve to strengthen our connections to land and place. She is an organizing structure that guides our governance, social, and educational systems. In fact, our collective rights as Indigenous people originate from our occupation and use of our lands. So taken together, these Indigenous perspectives on the land ensure our economic, social, health, education, and political well-being. Helping you to conceptualize some of these understandings in your own local context of Melbourne, I encourage you to look at the excellent new primers I was just introduced to that connects readers to such knowledge in the pre-colonial landscapes of this place. These are the two edited collections by Ross Jones, James Wahorn, and Marcia Langton, Dumbak Guwana, A History of Indigenous Australia and the University of Melbourne. And I was very fortunate to be able to attend the launch of the second volume the other evening called Voice. So please, I really encourage you to have a look. Mediating the overlapping landscapes of Indigenous leadership and colonial context, I propose Indigenous land relations as a decolonial framework that embodies practices of relationality and reciprocity to generate possibilities for leading from, with, and on the land. Now, let me describe two central tenets of an Indigenous land relations framework before we look to the practices that this framework then inspires. The first tenet is that Indigenous land relations decenters the human to situate knowledges, values, and practices of the land into an Indigenous pedagogy of leadership. Underlying this logic is the Indigenous worldview that land is physical, social, and a spiritual being, as I've said. Some even say a dear relative. Other Indigenous groups personify her as Mother Earth. And to me, she is Nimama Aki, a nurturing and life-giving force. By decentering the human, an Indigenous land relations approach allows us to conceive of every relationship possible in guiding our leadership practices, allowing us to challenge underlying values and assumptions that tend to drive decisions in mainstream institutions. Anishinaabe Leanne Simpson helped speak to the necessity of decentering the human in our efforts to address colonialism, fueling capitalism, fueling the devastating and dramatic climate change that we are seeing around the globe. In her new book, Theory of Water, Anishinaabe Maps to the Times Ahead, she brilliantly traces the historical and cultural interactions of Indigenous people with water in all its forms: ice, snow, liquid, and even our own breath. And all the practices then that direct us towards a sustainable future together in this world that flows from our relationship with water. Water as theory, that is, water as a source of knowledge, a practice, a way of thinking, she says, must decenter the human. For her, this means decentering the needs, desires, knowledges, and influences of humans to favor forms of life that layer many ecologies beyond physical bodies. Humans, she laments, and I quote her here, are always trying to make life more. And this leads to the diminishment of life. It leads to less life. As a second tenet, Indigenous land relations builds on the work of critical Indigenous and settler scholars who advocate for land education as a distinct educational approach aimed at disrupting the continued impacts of settler colonialism on Indigenous lands and livelihoods, which includes our knowledge systems, our governance structure, our decision-making processes, and our social organizations. And I want to acknowledge leading Indigenous theorists in this work, including Unguk scholar Eve Tuck, Anishinaabe Leanne Simpson, and Jianpo woman Aileen Morton Robinson, whose writings seek to intervene on the consequences of settler colonialism or possessive logics concerned with Indigenous lands. Indigenous people and the collective and collectives around the globe are engaged in everyday acts of strengthening their connections to their lands and waters. Indigenous land relations is a grounded but dynamic process of pursuing, renewing, defending, and enlivening collective Indigenous relationships to land and place. And I look at the work of Barker and Battelle, scholars Barker and Battelle, who are tracing sort of the genealogy, if you will, of Indigenous resurgence. And so as a form of resurgence, Indigenous land relations, and I quote them here, calls for Indigenous people to directly reconnect with traditional networks of human and more than human to generate situated power that can be used for both regenerating Indigenous social and environmental systems and confronting the ongoing invasion by settler colonial systems and infrastructure. Learning from natural systems is certainly starting to be taken seriously in leadership development, especially as the environments that leaders operate in are becoming increasingly complex. In her book, Designed Leadership, Maura Quayle leverages the creative and critical techniques from built environmental design principles, which I understand as landscape architecture, to form leadership in business, government, and academia. The main lesson of natural systems for leadership in her work is interconnectivity, where all elements of the natural system or of the natural systems are constantly interacting. She suggests that leaders can mirror the complex functionality, diversity, patterns, and resilience observed in nature to produce systemic change. And I quote her here. She says, "Natural systems are power. We need to pay attention to them," and I like this, "and to be humbled by them." Now, I want to recognize there's many outdoor leadership development experiences, Outward Bound. I was talking to Marcy McKenzie, who did a graduate or a thesis work, I believe, on Outward Bound, one of her works. Even looking at Victoria University here in Melbourne offers, I was interested to see, a Bachelor of Outdoor Leadership. So I'm just going to share one example here with you. And this is from the Foundation for Natural Leadership. And this is based in the Netherlands, which invites leaders to develop their leadership capacities through their Wilderness Leadership Transformation Program. And this is offered in various parts of the world. Now, their 4 to 6 day immersive experience in the wilderness focuses on disconnecting from mediated worlds, opening all senses to the experience, sharing with other leaders, and caring for nature, all through coaching, dialogue, critical reflection, and experiential learning. Over 3 studies, scholar Boy van Droffler looked at the impact and changes in leadership of 93 executive leaders who took part in this program, noting that these nature-based experiences facilitated a shift in mindset in participants' leadership style. That is to say that along with acquiring particular leadership skills, there was also a shift in mindset related to their self-perception, convictions and principles that they held, and an orientation towards compassionate listening. And that's just to give a few examples. My own observation of this body of scholarship suggests that even as such approaches promote the natural world as a source of inspiration for leadership practices, these Western approaches to promoting interactions with the land as a means of leadership development are seemingly for self-discovery, adventure, personal restoration, or a place to escape. And I'm sure that you can imagine how this well-intentioned, hyper-planned executive training tourism stands in sharp contrast to the long drives around Minduminasing with my dad, Joe. Now, let me share another story with you that might help us bring together how Indigenous land relations functions to cultivate leadership. And this one is from the Haudenosaunee people, who comprise an alliance of 6 Indigenous nations and whose original homelands straddle northeastern Canada, mainly southern Ontario and Quebec, and part of the United States. It is a story of the 3 sisters, identified as beans, corn, and squash, which is to say, plants derived from the land. Similar to the Anishinaabe story, there are certainly different tellings of the 3 sisters across Indigenous nations. And I'm drawn to the Haudenosaunee version for the way it has been taken up and analyzed in recent writings by Haudenosaunee scholar Kira Brandt-Barakova as well as Haudenosaunee illustrator Jill Long. Both of these writings introduce us to the three sisters by way of the Haudenosaunee creation story. Their retellings begin with Sky Woman, who lived in the sky world and one day fell through a hole in the sky world towards an endless sea below. Jill Long goes on to share in her writing. The animals of the endless sea saw her coming down, so they brought up soil from the bottom of the sea. They put the earth on the back of a giant turtle to create a safe place for her to land. Sky Woman was pregnant before she fell. After she landed on the back of the turtle, she gave birth to a daughter. Then the daughter grew into a young woman, and she also became pregnant. She died while giving birth to twin boys. Sky Woman buried her daughter in the new earth. From the daughter's grave grew 3 sacred plants, corn, bean, and squash. These plants provided for the daughter's sons, then for all of humanity. And these 3 plants, known to the Haudenosaunee as the Three Sisters, safeguarded the survival of the Haudenosaunee people for centuries. Potawatomi scholar and botanist Robin Wall-Kimmerer draws further into the story, bringing her practical botanical knowledge to bear in describing how these 3 sisters are nurtured and grow in their own distinct ways when she writes, "The corn is the firstborn and grows straight and stiff. It is a stem with a lofty goal, laddering upward, leaf by long-ribbed leaf. It must grow tall quickly. Making a strong stem is the highest priority first. It needs to be there for its younger sister, the bean. Beans put out a pair of heart-shaped leaves on just the stub of a stem, then another pair and another, all low to the ground. Touch receptors along the vine guide it to wrap itself around the corn in a graceful upward spiral, giving itself over to the embracing corn, keeping pace with its height and growth." Sounds like a middle child to me. That would be, sorry, I am the poor deprived middle child of the family. Meanwhile, squash, the late bloomer of the family, is steadily extending herself over the ground. As the leaves grow wider, they shelter the soil at the base of the corn and beans, keeping moisture in and other plants out. We can appreciate this story for the knowledge and many teachings that come from how sisters corn, bean, and squash so thoughtfully come together to grow and thrive, and then eventually ensure the health of the soil as all their roots decompose, returning nutrients back to the earth. This story demonstrates the sophisticated system of companion planting and food practices of Indigenous people. And these dear sisters are a reminder of the power and place of women to make our communities strong. However, in our time remaining, I want to add to all of this 2 land-based teachings that work strategically to center Indigenous land relations within leadership. The Three Sisters invites us to consider how we might cultivate relationality in our practices as educational leaders by finding ways of nurturing each other. Though the Three Sisters can grow independently of one another, they instead form an ecosystem, a community of plants living in relationship to one another, helping each other grow. Their relationship to one another reduces their vulnerability and creates conditions for healthy living. They are an embodiment of Indigenous relationality that recognizes connections between humans and the natural and ancestral worlds. But what distinguishes their connectedness is the multidimensional nature of their relationality that functions to enact obligation to one another and to the world around them. The Three Sisters are not just plants coexisting together. They are dear relatives, active and purposefully engaged with one another, exercising their commitments to expansive and diverse networks. This, I think, is a key insight to how relationality is practiced within Indigenous leadership and the unique way it can contribute to transforming colonial institutions. I recognize that relational views of leadership have been advanced within the scholarship of educational and organizational leadership theory and practice, and this work is important for several reasons. Scholars McKinley and Paulus summarize writing that points to relational leadership development in helping us move beyond individual competencies to focus on social processes that emphasize communication, interaction, problem solving within the collectives of groups, teams, and networks. While Indigenous relationality can expand on relational leadership theory and practice, I contend that Indigenous relationality is more than fostering a collaborative culture built on healthy relations and where relationality is only a human attribute. For example, acknowledgement of the social, ancestral, and other human relations associated with land-based worldviews may well invoke a deeper ethos of care and accountability to these relations that can be extended to mainstream institutions in decision and vision making. These are not disconnected realities for Indigenous leaders. If anything, Indigenous relationality formed through these valuable and expansive relationships transcends the nature of working relationships that are based solely on respectful and collective working conditions. Relational accountability to our ancestors and future generations emerging within a land-based worldview is enacted in our present leadership capacities. And I'm reminded here of Aileen Morton Robinson's assertion that relationality means experiencing the self as part of others, past, present, and future. At this point, I would like to make clear that Indigenous relationality is complex. So to avoid romanticization or essentializing, when relationality is seen only to restore balance, bring harmony, or ensure equilibrium. Even as the three sisters collaborate to live together, they must still fight invasive forces, negotiate the distribution of their resources above and below the soil, and even make sacrifices of themselves in untenable conditions. Indigenous relationality works to build assertive practices that take into account political realities whenever and wherever it is operating towards the collective well-being. Let us consider the role of universities to advance reconciliation so as to understand Indigenous perspectives on relationality in this national and institutional agenda in countries like Canada and Australia. Like many scholars and educators, I have become impatient with reconciliation. While I appreciate that reconciliation has raised awareness of settler colonial histories, all the talk about it simply has not done enough to dismantle colonial and normative structures in our institutions. And scholars have been troubling the concept of reconciliation, observed in its focus on good relations, meaning building positive and sustainable relations, strengthening relations, ensuring equitable relations, and even its disconnection from decolonization. So that's reading many, I'm going to say reconciliation websites in both Canada and the US. And this represents a limited understanding of relationality from Indigenous viewpoints. In my own work, I argue that if settler societies are to live up to their obligations to Indigenous-settler relations, we must look beyond living in good relations within our institutions to start living in right relations. Being in right relations seeks a more critical approach to relationality, seeking to overturn colonial difference by centering Indigenous knowledges, but more importantly, understanding the historical, social, and political differences of Indigenous citizenship, nationhood, and self-determination in our institutional commitments to indigeneity. Living in right relations assumes that those who lead educational and other institutions must be knowledgeable and willing to accept the unique legal and political status of Indigenous people and nations as set out in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Even though not legally binding, it establishes a universal framework on minimal standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous people. So just imagine if we honor Indigenous relations, not only by celebrating Indigenous cultures and knowledge contributions, but also investing in Indigenous nations by instilling a sense of responsibility towards First Nations through educating all our staff, faculty, and students in a comprehensive understanding of sovereignty. Indigenous relationality is political, and the transformation of our institutions through reconciliation requires leaders to ask the question posed by Sharon Stein, a decolonial higher education scholar and a colleague at UBC. And she poses the question to I would pose it to leadership here. Can I surrender my desires for control, authority, certainty, and security so that I might develop the humility, patience, and stamina that are required for this relational decolonial work? Now, I want to return us to the story of the three sisters to set out the practice of reciprocity. With these sisters, what these sisters emphasized in principle is what Robin Khmer refers to as a gift economy. Khmer's writing has been influential in my thinking about land relations framework for cultivating leadership. And these are her two books here. Her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, is wondrous. I just think it's wondrous in what it can teach us about leadership. Story after story, teaching after teaching, she recounts the wisdom of plants and the way they care for us, and in turn requires our care and our generosity. The science in these ecological systems that she reveals inspires my own day-to-day leadership. For instance, returning to her work on the three sisters, she says, "The most important thing each of us can know is our unique gift and how to use it in the world. Individuality is cherished and nurtured because, in order for the whole to flourish, each of us has to be strong in who we are and carry our gifts with conviction so that they can be shared with others. Being among the sisters provides a visible manifestation of what a community can become when its members understand and share their gifts." As a relational and spiritual ethic that acknowledges responsibilities towards a collective, reciprocity is enacted through Indigenous knowledge being given with respect and received with responsibility. Reciprocity, embedded within Khmer's gift economy logic, assumes mutual flourishing is necessary to a healthy and sustainable world. This worldview seems very different from colonial institutions being driven by economic and social gain. In her new short book, The Serviceberry, Khmer calls for prioritizing and strengthening relations that serve the community through what she calls gift thinking. She says, and I quote her here, "Imagine if we acknowledge that everything we consume is the gift of Mother Earth. We would take better care of what we are given. Mistreating a gift has emotional and ethical gravity, as well as ecological resonance." I believe this gift thinking is what we need to bring to the leadership practices of our institutions, to cycle reciprocity, gratitude, and a sense of community within our institutions would allow us to create systems of cooperation versus competition, promote abundance as in we have enough, rather than worry about scarcity and of resources, and flatten hierarchies that ascribe our worth in a system. So I want to bring us to a close by sharing a happy memory for me that the Three Sister Stories, the Three Sister story has allowed me to contemplate in the landscapes of leadership that we thought about here tonight. And this is a picture of my father. He went to the spirit world over two years ago, and this is just the last picture of him that I'd seen. It is a memory of my father who always found a way to make a home for the sisters to take root, no matter where life took him, making wherever we were as a family a place that was connected to his community. On the land behind my grandparents' home in Chiging, in the small garden at the back of a house we rented in the city of Toronto while he worked at the Native Canadian Centre on Spadina Street, and even on the small hillside of a gully-turned garden at our home in a small town in northern Ontario, he would always plant the Three Sisters. Now, as my memory recalls, his efforts weren't always successful. In some locations, the corn barely grew kernels on the husk, and in other places, squash became just too damp to expand on the ground. But I'm always inspired by his persistence to grow these dear relatives, sometimes in conditions likely not intended for them. Though the sisters of corn, bean, and squash offer gifts of support, giving, and protection, to me, and I think to my father, these sisters also symbolize possibility, courage, and self-determination, coming together to form a fierce love of ourselves as Indigenous people in places like a university setting where I work that are not entirely conceived by us, but where we want our Indigenous knowledges to flourish and our young Indigenous people to thrive. And I believe that a land-based relationship can be a source of inspiration for this much-needed transformation. Miigwech.
Thank you very much for that very inspirational sharing. I really love the Three Sisters story. That's not so much a question that I have, but one of the wonderful things about those three vegetables is that together they contain the 9 essential amino acids to make a complete protein.
And a beautiful soup. So I love your thinking.
Thank you so much for sharing. It brought tears to my eyes to see stories from home. I'm wondering, and I hope this doesn't come across as awful, but I wonder, to what extent can non-Indigenous people practice Indigenous leadership, if at all?
Yes. We want people to engage with Indigenous knowledges. We want people to engage with Indigenous ways of knowing. That's the focus of, I'm going to say, our work in education. When I think about the work of teacher education and wanting to ensure all teachers are equipped to include Indigenous knowledges, thinking about Melita's project and the significance of a project like that to then assist folks. Yes, we want leaders, all leadership, whether it's, as I said, in the classroom, whether it's in the community, to engage with these practices of relationality, of reciprocity. And I do believe it's possible to bring that into practices as settler allies and non-Indigenous people who are doing work in the institutions. So yes, I encourage it. I guess my only caveat to that might be to seek guidance. I think that there are protocols, and I didn't get into that here, Indigenous rights and protocols. I'm extending this work, so you're getting a kind of a snapshot of it. But I do think we need to be attentive to Indigenous protocols. So protocols being those systematic rules of working with Indigenous knowledges. I encourage folks to work with Indigenous people to learn from and gain this kind of knowledge. But yes, I would encourage folks to bring these into their practice.
I just want to give Jan a vote of thanks for coming all the way from Turtle Island to so-called Australia. I also want to just pick up on a couple of things that you said. I will never look at my childhood experiences of being dragged around the Wairarapa home on coastal places with my 5 siblings and several cousins. You were lucky. You have one person to your father. We had 60,000 people. Being dragged around the coast and doing things and never really thinking about how that has played into the sorts of positions I've held in my professional life, right, as I go back. And I think there's lots of people in this room that will be rethinking that as well, or maybe some of you already knew it, but, you know, just thinking about it differently, looking at leadership differently, looking at our childhood experiences and our landscapes of where we were raised. I was fortunate enough to be raised on country, as they say in Australia. In my own place in the Wairarapa in New Zealand, which is the bottom bit of the North Island on the east coast. And we got dragged around coastal places and landscapes to see what it is that our fathers were doing, right, or trying to do, and how that plays into my current thing. So you've given us a lot to think about. I feel that there's a lot of people here that might be thinking something similar or something, the same. Can I really recommend Robin Khmer's
work? Yes.
They are stunning. You know, she sort of brings you in. For those of you who haven't read them, I think for a start I'm thinking, a little bit navel gazing, you know, sort of, you know, how you read things, but in actual fact she draws you right in. And her books are just stunning, and she does give you a very different way of looking at the world. I love the idea also about the gifts, the notion of the gifts. She does mention it quite a lot in her books on the notion of the gift. So does Rona Kuokkanen.
Yes, yeah.
She talks about the gift
scholar
and connects that to the economies as well. And I really like that idea. And I'd like to talk about it further with you, about that exchange in some ways, but not a monetary exchange, that you remember that people who come, not only about the earth, but about people who come, for example, in the AFSI program, Damien, I'm thinking about the PO and the gifts that they give our gift of knowledge that they give our fellows, and they walk that line, you know, and what our fellows give to them in that program. So I just want to say thank you. You've given us lots to think about. You have enriched our understandings about leadership and about culture, in actual fact. And there were so many things there that I thought we could relate to, that I've seen and observed in Australia and also at home in New Zealand. So I thank you once again. Can I ask everybody just to
cite me? No? Can you ask everyone just to cite me?
He wants to be cited.
No.
Just the notion of gifts.
Yes!
Jan, thank you so much. Just to acknowledge his words, thank you for this amazing, powerful, world-class lecture. It was so deep, and so I think we could all feel, and it all made us reflect on our own journeys, on our leadership, on our way, how we are, how we relate to each other. So thank you so much, and congratulations again of being our Miegunyah visiting fellow. It's amazing to have you here. And to all of you, thank you so much for attending and for being here. This concludes our evening tonight. Thank you, safe travels, and please see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.